This conference will now be recorded. This conference will now be recorded.
Okay, so we'll be starting with a new chapter today, a new topic, and that's the large intestine. Last time we finished with the major part of the small intestine, only the stoma remains, and that we'll be covering at the end of the large intestine chapter, because stomas are common to both the small intestine and the large intestine. They are just the acknowledgements and the disclosures. Now, starting with the anatomy of the large bowel, and we all know the parts. This is elementary anatomy. The colon extending from the ileocecal wall up to the sigmoid, and from there the rectum starts, and then you go the anal canal. If you look at the colon, it's 1.5 meters long and about 1/5 of the total intestinal length. Has got both the intraperitoneal and the retroperitoneal. The intraperitoneal segment and the retroperitoneal, basically the ascending, the descending colon, and the intraperitoneal, the sigmoid, and the transverse colon. Now, the identification of the colon is not very difficult from the exterior, from the serosal surface. You got the tinea coli, which are the three condensations across the longitudinal axis of the large bowel, three in number, about 0.2 inches wide, and extending right from the cecum up to the sigmoid colon. Beyond that, they gradually fan out to convert themselves into the longitudinal muscle of the rectum. And of course, the appendices epiploicy, which are tags of peritoneum filled with fat. Now let's look at the tinea coli. And these tinea coli, these are basically in three longitudinal bands. These are the longitudinal muscles being condensed into three bands, and they converge from the appendix. So they're converging here, and from there they branch off, going across the ascending, the transverse, the descending colon, and then reaching the sigmoid, and then fanning out to form the longitudinal muscle of the rectum, as I said earlier. Now, in the cecum and the ascending colon and the descending colon, the pattern of tinea coli is slightly different from the transverse colon for the simple reason that there is a rotation of the transverse colon. So if you look at the tinea coli of the ascending colon, descending colon, and the sigmoid, you got three of them. The tinea librida, which is the first one, placed anteriorly. So that's the red one. You see the red one? That's the first tinea. Ascending, descending sigmoid colon. But what happens in the transverse colon? In the transverse colon, it is placed inferiorly. It would be here. That's why the red line is not seen out here. The second is the tinea mesocolica, which is the part which is in the mesenteric part. So the mesentery of the ascending colon attached out here. So this tinea coli is around the mesenteric part of the ascending colon, descending in the sigmoid colon. And when you go to the transverse colon, so in the cecum, ascending, descending, and sigmoid, they are all placed towards the mesenteric side. That's why it's not tinea mesocolica. In the transverse colon, at the side of the attachment of the transverse mesocolon, because the mesentery, but then that will be placed inferiorly or posteriorly. The tinea ommentalis is posterolateral, at least somewhere here behind, and that is the green line out here. And if you see the green line is climbing here, and then it's seen anteriorly. So it is in the transverse colon, it will be placed anterior-superiorly, it's anterior-superior, and that is the part which comes in contact with the greater omentum. That's why the name tinea ommentalis. So it's the twist of the transverse colon which gives it a different orientation, transverse colon, as opposed to the rest parts of the. Now, the relation as surgeons, we are basically sticking to the surgical anatomy. So we as surgeons are more concerned with the posterior relations of the colon, because that's what we have to encounter when we carry out any kind of mobilization of the colon, whether it's a ascending colon or the descending colon. Now, if you look at the posterior relations, which are common to both of them, would be medially this is the psoas muscle. Laterally here you'll find the quadratus lumborum. See the quadratus lumborum? So the two muscles are the posterior most. Anterior to these muscles and between the colon and these muscles would be the kidney. You see the kidney, the ureter. So whenever you're trying to mobilize, so these are common on both the sides. So on whether you're doing a mobilization of the descending colon or you're doing a mobilization of the ascending colon, you have to be careful about the ureters, the vessels, which vessels are talking about, the testiculars and the ovarians, depending on whether you're male or female, and the kidney and the ureters. Now, what is different in the right and the left side is, on the right side, you have to be careful about this structure. See the structure? That is the duodenal C. So when you're trying to reflect the ascending colon medially, you have to be very, very careful about not injuring the duodenum. On the left side, you have the additional tail of the pancreas when you're trying to mobilize the left colon flexion. So that is the only difference between the posterior relations on the left and the right side. But otherwise, you have to be very, very careful about the kidney, the ureter, and the gonadal vessels on either side, whether it's a male or a female. And on the right, the duodenum, and the left, the tail of the pancreas, depending upon you're doing the right or the left side. We are hearing a lot about hostration. So what are basically the hostrations? Now, the first is the haustral fold. The haustral fold, it is nothing but a mucosal fold within the colon. And these folds are circumferential, either total circumferential or interrupted. See these interruptions? The interrupted fold, see the interrupted fold, the reflection interrupted fold. This is basically a skygram. So these are more commonly incomplete circumferentially. So they're incomplete folds as opposed to the bulbi convantis, which we were talked about when we talk about the small bowel, maximally found in the jejunum, and as you go down toward the ileum, they become less and less, right? The haustra, on the other hand, refer to the series of small segmented pouches in between the circular muscle. So this pouching, this would be the haustral fold, and this would be the haustra, right? So the haustra is in between the two haustral folds, and that is the difference between haustral and a haustral fold. They give the colon a segmented appearance. See the segmented appearance of the colon? That's what we're looking at, right? Now, why are these haustras found at all? Why are they formed at all? Now, the reason is simple. The reason we're talking about two kinds of muscles in the colon. And if you look at this figure, you'll find the two muscles: the circular muscle, the inner, and in the outer longitudinal muscle. Now, the outer longitudinal muscle has been condensed into three tinea. Now, the problem with the tinea is that the length of the tinea is much less than the total length of the colon. So the discrepancy between the length, whenever this muscle is going to contract, what's going to happen is going to bunch up, and these would move laterally. That means the colon will be pushed out laterally in between. But how these segments form? The segments basically are formed because of the circular muscle contraction. So remember, at any given point of time, both the muscles are contracting. The circular muscles are contracting, and the longitudinal muscles are contracting. So when the circular muscles are contracting, they will give rise to the segmentation. See these segment, the one segment, two segment, three segment. That is because circular muscle, this muscle has contracted here. So it has gone in, and this has gone out. Now what leads to the further outward movement? Because when the tinea is going to contract, it is going to bunch up these. Why bunch up? Because the discrepancy between the length of the tinea and the length of the colon. So it is basically a combined contraction of the circular and the tinea coli longitudinal muscle, which gives rise to the typical feature of a haustra. What are the epiploic appendices? Because we said, remember, two things which are identified in the colon for you: one, epiploic appendices, and number two, haustras. Now, there are a number of synonyms to the epiploic appendices. You may be called as a epiploic appendages or appendices epiploicy, appendix epiploica, omental appendices, and these are just synonyms to it. Now, what are they actually in anatomically? They are basically peritoneal tags with fat, and they attach to the colon by a vascular stop. Each appendice has got a small one or two colonic end arteries and a small draining vein. So they have got vascularity. Each of them would be around 1 to 2 centimeters thick and 0.5 to 5 centimeters long, and attached next to the anterior and the posterior tinea coli, predominantly at the sigmoid colon and the cecum. So the maximum number of tinea would be identifiable in the sigmoid and cecum. That doesn't mean they are not found in other parts of the colon. They are, but the maximum concentration would be in the sigmoid and the cecum. Now, do they have any function? Now, a number of hypothetical views have been put forward. We really don't know, but what has the role that has been ascribed to them would has been as a soft and flexible support, a cushion to the colon. Number two, it could be having an immune response like a small omentum, or it could be partly responsible some kind of colonic absorption capability. Now, Is there any pathological state attached to it? Why are we so concerned? Apart from the identification part of it, the debatable physiological part of it, do they have any kind of pathological significance? Yes. One is the typical peritoneal mice or peritoneal loose body that we often encounter when we do laparotomies. We find these small whitish bodies floating or found associated inside the peritoneal cavity. Now, one reason could be an infarction or entrapment of the epiploic appendages, which is then calcified, appearing in the abdominal cavity as an incidentally found item, I would like to call it, during the laparoscopy, laparotomy, or during radiological evaluation, because calcified, it can be seen on a radiological scan. It could be a parasitized appendices epiloicy, which basically means in rare cases shedding off from the colon and reattaching itself to a surface such as the lower aspect of the spleen. Number three, you could be having an acute infection in the epiploicy, and that is acute epiploicy appendicitis. Now, this can mimic acute right iliac fossa pain or a pain in any other part of the body, but it's important because it could be mimicking a right iliac fossa pain, and because mimicking right iliac fossa pain, it could be mimicking a acute appendicitis, but it's usually self-limiting occurrence. It can also be responsible for adhesions. Simultaneous surrounding inflammation can result in cervical obstruction. It could be responsible for local abscess formation, simulating a neoplastic lesion, or it could be a starting point of an intersusception leading to bowel obstruction and peritonitis. They are all possible complications of a pathological state of the epiploic appendages, which we really didn't know until now. Now, what is the Toll's line and fascia? Again, an important applied importance. The Toll's line is so important because if you see here, it is a white line. You can see the white line. And why is this line important? Because this denotes a avascular plane. So what exactly is the Toll's line? Now, when we do a laparotomy, we identify it by the fact that when we go inside the abdomen with the parietal peritoneum, and as we proceed towards the descending or the ascending colon, you find that there is a transition from the parietal peritoneum onto the visceral peritoneum, and there is a line in between. Now, that line embryologically is a sandwich between the mesothelial layer of the mesocolon and underlying mesothelial layer of the retroperitoneum. Now let's look at this figure. This is basically a developmental figure, just to make you understand. This is the time, if you remember, when we were talking about the 3 stages of rotation of the bowel, we said the last stage, it is a fixation of the bowel, fixation of parts of the bowel, and that is when the ascending colon, descending colon become partly retroperitoneal. They lose their mesentery. Now, before that, the ascending colon has a mesentery. Now, what happens? Why does it lose its mesentery? Now, in the 3rd stage, what's happening is that this is going to rotate, and this is the parietal peritoneum is going to combine. See the rotation occurring out here, so that this layer of the visceral peritoneum, that's the lateral layer of the visceral peritoneum, and this part of the parietal peritoneum, they're going to fuse. Behind is lying the mesothelial layer of the retroperitoneum. So there are 3 layers actually out here. One, the visceral. Number 2, the mesothelial layer of the parietal peritoneum, and the mesothelial layer of the retroperitoneum. Now, these three would form what is known as the Toll's fascia. So, when this is going to come here, the visceral peritoneum attaches to this parietal peritoneum, and it gives rise to this figure. And here you have the Toll's line. So, it is basically a fusion of the lateral leaf with the mesothelial layer of the parietal peritoneum. And if you're going to go into this layer, very well seen out here. See, this is the right paracolic gutter, and this here is the white line. So if we're going to enter here, this is the junctional layer known as the Toll's fascia. The white line and the Toll's fascia. If you are doing dissection here, dissecting here, this is an absolutely avascular plane. You won't have any kind of bleed. You enter here, you have a troublesome bleeding. You enter here, you're entering into the mesenteric vessels, and again troublesome bleeding. You're entering into the mesocolon. So if you look at this figure carefully, you'll find this was the lateral margin or the lateral fold of the visceral peritoneum. This is the visceral peritoneum, the mesocolon. 1 layer, 2 layer, the medial and the lateral. This is going to fuse with what? This is going to fuse with the visceral layer of the retroperitoneum. In between, you've got what is known as the Tal's fascia, and this is the Tal's line. So now you know the embryological genesis Tal's line, you know the importance that this is the plane through which you should enter if at all you want to go in for any kind of mobilization of the colon. Look at the arterial supply of the large bowel. The inflow is through three vessels. We all know that. Number one is the ileocolic, the right colic, so the superior mesenteric artery, inferior mesenteric artery, supplying the three, the ileocolic, the right colic, and the middle colic with the right and the left branches. And you've got the left colic, the inferior mesenteric artery with the left colic, the sigmoid branches, and of course the superior rectal branch. Now, so these are the supply and the junctional area. If you remember last time also we specified that the junction is lying between the medial 2/3 and the left lateral 1/3. So the right 2/3 and the left 1/3, that is the junctional area. 2/3 and left 1/3. So that is the area where you got an anastomotic point, which is also known as the Drummond's point, or the arterial arcade of the Drummond or the marginal artery, and the anastomotic point is found out here. Now, the collaterals between the small, the superior mesenteric and the inferior mesenteric, I think we had also specified last time. And the one is the marginal artery of Drummond, is the marginal artery of Drummond, and number two is the arc of Riolan, which is the meandering mesenteric artery. Here you can find that the connection between the inferior mesenteric to the left colic, see this, and the superior mesenteric to the middle colic. So the middle colic and the left colic are communicating with each other with a branch, and that branch is the arc of Riolan. So that is the meandering mesenteric artery, and this is important. Why? For the simple reason, if you got a block in the superior mesenteric, there's a block out here, the vascularity could still be maintained through this meandering artery and the arterial arcade or the marginal arcade of Drummond. Now, the marginal artery, it is about 2.5 to 3.8 centimeters. So this distance is important, 2.5, 3.8 centimeters. And the applied importance is very simple, that whenever we're doing a colostomy, we put in a catheter or a rod out here. Now see, if we put the rod here or the catheter out here, trying to pull the colon out, we are going to damage the marginal artery. If you're going to put it out here, we will not damage the marginal artery. So the applied importance is that to prevent the damage of marginal artery, the colostomy rod should lie adjacent to the colonic wall and not away from the colonic wall. Remember this, that is very, very important for all those surgical residents or those who are striving to become surgeons. You should remember where the colostomy rod should be put in. It should never be put at a distance from the colon. Why? You will damage the marginal artery just by the side of the colonic wall. Now, the anastomosis we said, which is occurring out here, 2/3 and 1/3, right 2/3, left 1/3, it is absent in 5% of patients. And that may create a problem if you got a block in any of these vessels. Say if you got a block in superior mesenteric artery, then the inferior mesenteric artery cannot supply that part. If you got a part of the block in the inferior mesenteric, the superior mesenteric cannot take care of the left side of the colon. Why? Because that anastomotic side is missing in 5% of patients. Now, when these marginal arteries, they're lying along the colon, they give rise to straight vessels known as vasa recta. Now, these vasa rectas are of two types. Number one, short, which are entering. See this vasa recta entering through the mesentery and entering through the vessel wall out here, creating those weak areas from where you got the diverticulosis. We'll talk about that in one of the subsequent lectures. The second is the long vasa recta, see, which is encircling the colon. Encircling the colon. And these are important. Why? Because they maintain the vascularity of from the serosal surface and from the muscular surface all around the circumference. If you have any interruption here, there are chances of having a ischemia in this particular area. Chances, why do I say chances? For the simple reason that it's not a must. It could happen, it may not happen. The connection between the inferior mesenteric and the systemic is through the middle rectal artery. The superior rectal with terminal branch of the inferior mesenteric, the terminal branch inferior mesenteric, superior rectal artery, and the middle rectal artery. This anastomosis maintains circulation from the systemic and the inferior mesenteric artery. right? Now, important nuggets that you have to remember is that whenever you're going in for any kind of anastomosis of the intestine, when you cut the intestine and trying to anastomose the two edges, you have to be sure that both the edges have got enough vascularity in it. And how do you ensure? One, you can have a naked eye. If you're doing a laparotomy, by a naked eye examination, you see that oozing from the cut edges, you're very sure. You can see the color of the bowel and everything. What about laparoscopic? In laparoscopic, one of the best methods now for ensuring or seeing whether adequate perfusion exists or not is by doing an indo-cyano green perfusion, which gives a green color and seen by special telescopes known as the infrared telescopes, and seen 1 minute after an IV bolus, which is given in the doses of 0.25 milligram per kilogram. Now, the second important nugget is that 2 centimeters of the colon can be stripped off its mesentery. The circulation mesentery denoted colonic wall is maintained by the mucosal vessels. So what are we saying? We are saying that suppose I have cut this edge and now I'm trying to anastomose these two edges. I can have a part of the colon about 1 to 2 centimeters bereft of any mesentery. Bereft of any mesentery. That means without any mesentery, and that can still exist. Why? Because this vasa recta, which has entered through the mesenteric side, is supplying the whole of the system by an alternate circulation from the mucosal surface outwards, right? So remember, it is not that if you have stripped the mesentery of the large bowel, it is not the bowel is not going to sustain itself. If it is only 1-2 centimeters, this gets an added importance when we're talking about difficult colostomies, construct difficult colostomies. We'll come to that when we talk about colostomy. The venous drainage is again simple. The corresponding vessel, that means the superior mesenteric and the inferior mesenteric veins. The inferior mesenteric vein is going to join the splenic vein, and when it traverses from its origin up to the splenic vein, it is lying on the left side of the artery. Left side of the artery, because the inferior mesenteric artery lies somewhere here, the aorta is somewhere here, here would be here, see. So it's lying on the left side of the artery. That's one. And number two, the splenic vein is lying on the upper margin of the upper border of the pancreas. So that's where the junction is there. There could be alternative junction. The inferior mesenteric, instead of opening to the splenic, can be opening directly into the superior mesenteric vein. That could be happening. The second is the superior mesenteric vein, and along its course again is going to accompany the artery, but he is going to lie on the right side of the artery because the aorta is here. Superior mesenteric arises from here. So the superior mesenteric lies on the right of the artery. The inferior mesenteric lies on the left of the corresponding artery, right? And the superior mesenteric is going to terminate by joining the splenic vein, and this termination occurs where? At the transpyloric plane around the lower margin of the L1 vertebrae, and there it merges splenic vein to form the hepatic portal vein. What is the applied importance? The applied importance is one important feature of this venous is that when you have the veins of the ascending colon, the transverse colon, there is an anastomosis, a marginal vein. Now, this is deficient in 20% patients, a very high percentage. And these patients, if you have a surgical interruption of any one of these veins, there could be what is known as a venous infarction. A venous infarction. So the marginal vein of the descending colon is always excellently present, and it is never deficient as on the right side. And that is why, that is the reason that if you want to have a colonic substitute for an esophagus, it should be the left colon rather than the right colon. That is the main reason. That means the vascularity, both the arterial and the venous, towards the descending colon is better as compared to the ascending colon. That is the applied importance of the venous supply. Looking at the colonic lymphatics, they are again important. You can remember by two mnemonics. One mnemonic is EPIC or PIC, and the second mnemonic is what you know as PID. You can remember it as a pelvic inflammatory diseases. This is going from medial, from central to lateral. This is going from out to in. If we look from out to in, you got the epicolic or the pericolic or the panacolic lymph nodes from here. Then you've got the intermediate, that is the eye, and then you got the central at the origin of these vessels. So that is the epic or PIC for you. And the second is the PID. You're going from proximal, you're going to the intermediate and the distal. Proximal, intermediate, distal. So whether you want to go from central to out or from out to central, you can either follow the mnemonic PID or you can PID, or you can follow the mnemonic EPIC or PIC. Just remember, there are almost about 100 to 150 lymph nodes in the mesentery of the colon, and the most important applied importance is that whenever you're going for any kind of colonic resection, a sampling of lymph nodes should be minimum 12 lymph nodes. That is a figure agreed upon by everybody, and at least 12 lymph nodes have to be evaluated. So harvesting of 12 lymph nodes is standard whenever you're going for any kind of colonic resection for malignancy purposes. So these are the important features. I'm not going to go into the names of these of the lymph nodes, more so the Japanese classification, which is a classification for the colonic lymph nodes, and they've numbered it as the red, blue, yellow, green, gray, and white. So you've got the pericolic starting from lateral to medial. You got the blue color, which are the intermediate, and these are central ones. These are main lymph nodes. And more central to that would be the white lymph, which are the para-aortic and the para-caval lymph nodes. The para-caval lymph nodes and the inter-aortocaval lymph nodes. So these are those lymph nodes, and this is a Japanese classification for these lymph nodes. Looking at the nerve supply, you got both the sensory part, you got the sympathetic sensory combination going to the same dermatome, and you got the parasympathetic arising from the pelvic splanchnic plexus. So that would basically is important to know from which segment. That gives an idea where the pain would be referred, which sensory dermatome would be having the referred pain. So if you have got a colonic pain up to the supply of the mesenteric artery, you'd always be having an umbilical pain. If you got a pathology in the lateral part of the transverse colon and the descending and the sigmoid colon, you'll be having a suprapubic pain. So pain of cecum, ascending colon, transverse colon, right 2/3 would be felt at the umbilicus, and on the left side, descending colon and the sigmoid would be felt in the pelvic area. Now, these spinal visceral sensory fibers, see, they're traversing the three important ganglions, the celiac ganglion, supramesenteric ganglion, and the inferior mesenteric ganglion, and from there they send the supply to the respective organs. On the other hand, parasympathetic got the ganglion very near to the organs, and they relay the parasympathetic fibers, right? Now, the physiology of the colon, the food residue reaches the cecum at 4 hours. That's very important. Why? Because when you're going in for any kind of contrast study, oral contrast study, and you want to visualize the ileocecal junction, you have to visualize it around 4 to 5 hours. So a normal diet reaches the cecum at 4 hours after meal and the rectum at 24 hours after the meal. The absorptive, the three important functions. Number one, the absorptive function. Number two, the storage. And number three, the colonic bacterial function. The absorptive function is primarily the water absorption. By the time the food has reached the colon, it is already 90% water has already been absorbed. So it's only 10% remaining. And out of that 10% remaining, the rest of it is absorbed. What is left behind is only 150, 250 cc remaining in the feces. That means out of 1 liter, you got 150, 250 cc remaining. That means about 800 ml or 700 ml is again being reabsorbed throughout the colon. The sodium is being absorbed by an active mechanism, chloride by a passive mechanism, and the glucose, fatty acid, amino acid, and vitamins are being absorbed. Now, you would say the absorption of these, you were talking about, they were being absorbed in the jejunum and the ileum. So how come they are still present in the colon? Now, these are basically those which have been minimally produced locally in the colon. So it's not the glucose that you have eaten. No, it's not the fatty acid in your diet. It's not the amino acid in your diet. No, these are basically those which are produced in smaller amounts locally in the colon, and they would be reabsorbed back into the colon. The storage function and the colonic bacterial function is again important. What about the colonic bacteria? What are we looking at? We're looking at the anaerobic bacteroids and the bifid bacteria, the important constituents of the bacteria colonizing the colon. And what are they important for? Number one, they are important for fermenting the fiber, that undigested polysaccharide. Why are these important? They are the most important nutrients supplying the colonic endothelial cells. Why? Because they produce the short chain fatty acids like butyrate, which are used as fuel by the colonic enterocytes, and daily energy requirements when they are absorbed into the body. So primarily, the integrity of the colonic enterocytes is dependent on these bacteria fermenting the undigested polysaccharide and generating short chain fatty acid. And number two, the fermentation of fiber also produces the flatus, which consists primarily of nitrogen, and carbon dioxide. Bacteria, the second function of these bacteria, apart from producing the short chain free fatty acid, is that they're also producing large amounts of vitamins, especially vitamin K and type of vitamin B, that's biotin, for absorption into the blood. And factors which are going to disrupt your microorganism population, large intestine, is going to make a difference in your nutritional capabilities of the colon. So antibiotics, stress, parasite, they all disrupt this bacterial flora and its function. The motility in the colon is very important. Three kinds of motility that we're talking about, right? One is the haustral contraction, number two, peristalsis, number three is the mass movement, and fourth is the gastrocolic reflex, which is part of the mass movement. So you can say you got four kinds, or you can say three kinds, whatever. One is the haustral contraction. I told you there's a contraction of circular muscle fiber, and what happens when both the contract, the segment generates itself, it is going to churn the food inside. So the ileal chyme which has come into the colon, it is going to be mixed, distending the haustrum, and then it is going to push that food into the next haustrum. So from one segment to the next segment. That is what is happening in a haustral contraction. So it is a very slow process occurring approximately every 25-30 minutes for a duration of only 1 minute, and primarily occurring in the haustral. The peristaltic activity is the activity which is found throughout the bowel, but here, as compared to the rest of the bowel, that means small bowel, stomach, and so forth, here it is very slow. So in the large intestine, the peristaltic activity. The third is the mass movement, which is the propulsive movement, which is the most important movement as far as the onward transmission of the fecal content is concerned and ultimate defecation is concerned. And these are strong waves which start midway through the transverse colon. So they're starting at the transverse colon, somewhere in the mid part transverse colon, and they quickly flow the contents toward the rectum. And they occur at least 3 to 4 times per day, either while you eat or immediately afterward. When you're eating and you have this propulsive movement, then you'd like to call it a gastrocolic reflex, which is also part of a number of diseases of the intestine, but it's also there even as a normal physiological part. And this is a food intake inside the stomach, leads to stomach distension, breakdown of products of digestion, and they reach the small bowel to provoke an increased motility, including mass movement of the colon. And number two, the fiber in the diet both softens the stool and increases the power of this colonic contraction. So now we know that the colon has got four kinds of motility. Coming to the disease, that's ulcerative colitis. We only talk about this disease today because the extensive colitis. Look at the epidemiology of ulcerative colitis. It is a non-specific inflammation of the mucosa and submucosa on the rectum. Remember that. Non-specific inflammation of the mucosa and submucosa. Unlike Crohn's, which can affect any part of the gastrointestinal tract, ulcerative colitis is characteristically involving only the large bowel. Remember that. Number two, sex predilection. Male, female are almost equal, but in the age group 40 years, the male are more involved as compared to the females. The maximum age group is, however, 40 years. Uncommon, the malignant potential, this is logical factor. Over to you. Ulcerative colitis alone, malignancy in the left colon. If you have the sclerosing cholangitis, along with ulcerative colitis, then malignancy is 5 times more common and more on the right side. So see the difference, the left side, the right side, and the incidence 5 times. The patterns of involvement are 3, or rather 4. The colonic involvement is in the form of proctitis. See the red part, the left-sided, the affected region, and the extensive pancolitis. Now, the pancolitis has been defined as if there is involvement of any part of the colon proximal to the splenic flexion. See, this is the splenic flexion. Anything proximal to it, if it is involved, you'll name it pancolitis, right? So, in almost all cases, 95% of the time, the rectum is involved. At the time of presentation, a patient comes to you. At that time, you may not find rectal inflammation. At that time, so you will find that at time of presentation, almost 60% would have proctitis. Almost 45% will have left-sided colitis that we just now talked about, the sigmoid and the descending colon. And 35% will be having what is known as the pancolitis. That means the part of the proximal to the splenic flexion. Now, 10% of patients would be having what is known as a backwash iliatus. Now, what is the backwash iliatus? Backwash iliatus is basically iliatus involving 30 centimeters of ileum, which is somewhere here. There's the ileum, see, terminal part of the ileum. Now, in an incompetent ileocecal wall, if the ileocecal wall is incompetent, there is a migration or a back push of the colonic bacteria into the ileum, soiling the ileum with the colonic bacteria, which should not be there. So this reflux of the noxious inflammatory mediators from the colon into the ileum leads to superficial mucosal inflammation of the terminal ileum known as backwash iliatus. So backwash iliatus is nothing but a part of the ulcerative colitis. Looking at the causes of ulcerative colitis, you have a combination of factors causing dysfunctional immunoregulation in the intestinal wall. So the bottom line is that this similar to Crohn's disease, this is also a dysfunctional immunoregulation which is manifesting in the intestinal wall. The causes, one could be dietary, a low fiber diet. That is why this is predominantly a disease of the affluent class who tend to eat less of fiber, more of refined food. Food allergies, food additives, sulfate reducing bacteria, they produce increased amount of hydrogen sulfide, or smokers. The funny part is smoking is beneficial for ulcerative colitis in the sense that smokers tend to have less ulcerative colitis as compared to non-smoker. That's the only, I think it's the only advantage of smoking. I would not suggest it to be a reason why you should start smoking. Now, why do smokers benefit? They produce hydrogen cyanide, which combines the hydrogen sulfide, leading to isothiocyanate, which is non-toxic. Apart from dietary, the second thing is imbalance of regulated inflammation in the intestinal wall, and seen in the form of increase in a number of interleukins, right, from 4, 5, 6, 10, 13, and of course, appendectomy before 20 years of age is protective, is a point in favor of imbalance of regulated inflammation in the intestinal wall. The third factor could be NSAIDs, and these are non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs which aggravate the ulcerative colitis. Smoking, we already said, is protective, and genetic factors, right? Now, what about the immune basis? So we are talking about the dietary, the imbalance of inflammation, the NSAID, smoking, and the immune basis. The immune basis is seen in the form of immune destruction of rectocolonic mucosa. So what is the base of this conjecture? Number one, we find serum and mucosal autoantibodies against intestinal epithelial cells. They may be involved. The presence of two specific antibodies which now become markers for ultrasound for ulcerative colitis. One is what is known as the perinuclear anti-neutrophil cytoplasmic antibody, also known as PANCA, and anti-Saccharomyces cerevisiae antibody, that are ASCA, two important antibodies which are now also markers for ulcerative colitis. So these are there in inflammatory bowel disease. Now, when you say inflammatory bowel disease, remember we talk about three diseases: inflammatory bowel disease, number one, CD, Crohn's disease, number two, UC, ulcerative colitis, and number three, non-specific colitis. So remember that three types of IBDs: number one, ulcerative; number two, Crohn's; and number three is a non-specific colitis. Okay. Now, in addition, so what is the third point if you have immune basis? We find that appendectomy and ulcerative colitis, they share an immune relationship. And how do we find that? Number one, the lower incidence of ulcerative colitis in patients who have undergone previous appendectomy. And that also, if the appendectomy has been performed below 20 years of age. And of course, if the appendectomy has been performed for a inflammatory disorder as opposed to a non-specific reason. Right? For example, what is a non-specific reason for appendectomy? You're doing a laparotomy, you find appendix, you feel it is inflamed, you remove it. It may not be inflamed. So that is a non-specific reason for doing an appendectomy. The other reasons for non-specific appendectomy, this is one of which came to my mind. So lower incidence of ulcerative colitis if appendectomy was performed for an inflammatory disorder. So this is probably got an immune basis to it. The genetic basis of ulcerative colitis runs in families. 15% affected first degree relative. That means if my father is affected, the chance of me having it would be 15%. Identical twins, that means identical siblings, 10% affected. If it's dizygotic, 3% affected. Caucasians, maximum in USA, Canada, UK. So these are those developed countries in the north and the western world. Variations identified include those in DNA repair genes, class 2 major histocompatibility complexes, 12 genomic regions alterations on these genomes listed here, and usually multiple defects are required to produce a genetic based ulcerative colitis. 75% exhibit perinuclear anti-neutrophil cytoplasmic antibody, we just not talked about that, and stress increases the relapse rate. The other causes of ulcerative colitis could be environmental factors, increase in sulfate-reducing bacteria, decrease in Klebsiella, increase in sulfate-reducing and decrease in Klebsiella. Vitamin A and D both are antioxidants. If you got low levels of these, you may have increased incidence of ulcerative colitis or chance of exacerbation of ulcerative colitis. Psychological and psychosocial stress factors can precipitate exacerbations, and milk consumption may exacerbate the disease. Looking at the gross and pathophysiology, it's primarily, we said, mucosal and superficial submucosal. We already said that. What do you find? You find an uninterrupted superficial non-specific inflammation of the mucosa and the superficial submucosa extending into the colon starting from the rectum. And how does the mucosa look like? It is granular, it is swollen, it is friable. There are erosions in it, and there are frank ulcerations. The ulceration may be such that the whole of the endothelium has been ripped off, looking like a severely denuded area. So the whole of the ulcer is denuded of any epithelium. All the ulcerated areas with passive time, they become covered with granulation tissue. So initial denuded area, later granulation tissue formation. And the ulcer margins become undermined, and they appear as formation of polypoidal mucosal excrescences, which are known as inflammatory polyps or pseudopolyps, right? So excrescences which are found are appearing in the form of a pseudopolyp. Excessive fibrosis is not a feature of the disease, but if you find strictures, they are usually not a feature. They are more commonly found with Crohn's disease, but they are found in 5 to 12% of patients with ulcerative colitis. And what is very important about this, that is, if you find a stricture, always rule out a carcinoma of the colon. And the stricture that you find in these patients of ulcerative colitis is not really a fibrotic stricture. It is because of muscularis mucosal hypertrophy. So that is the distinction between Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis. In Crohn's, the stricture is based on a fibrotic basis, and here the base is a mucosal, the muscularis mucosal hypertrophy. All layer involvement in toxic megacolon, perforation, necrosis, we said it's primarily mucosa, superficial submucosa. But when you have got the most fulminant type of ulcerative colitis, which is known as toxic megacolon, there you got all layer involvement, not only the mucosa and superficial submucosa, it is all layer involvement, and that is why perforation necrosis is more common in these patients. If you look at the microscopic, the lamina propria and crypts of the labral cone, they are infiltrated with inflammatory cells, and these cells are, apart from polymorphs, they are also the toxic T cells, B cells, and plasma cells, apart from the polymorphs. And these B cell plasma cells, they also tend to produce increased amount of IgG and IgE immunoglobulins. As soon as this happens, soon crypt abscesses may appear, and there's loss of villi. The initial increased amount of mucin production is there, but with the passive time, because of mucosal damage, the goblet cells, they go on decreasing. And when you have a decreased goblet cells, then what happens? There is a decreased amount of mucin production. So to start with, increased mucin, later on decreased mucin. Still later, dysplastic changes appear in the mucosal endothelium, and here low dysplasia in a colectomy specimen. Now, why the dysplastic change is important? That if you've done a colectomy, you find on histopathology dysplasia, look for colon, carcinoma colon. Why? There are 10 to 20% chances of having carcinoma colon. If you have high-grade dysplasia, the chances of having a carcinoma colon increase to 40%. This is how ulcerative colitis looks like. See, these are the ulcers there. There is to see the whole of the granular mucosa. It's not normal mucosa. Whole of it is granular red mucosa. That's ulcerative colitis. The signs and symptoms are, the main symptoms of ulcerative colitis are two: number one, rectal bleeding, and number two, mucosal discharge from the rectum. Two are always present. Along with that, in mild cases, you may have tenesmus, which is basically a strong urge to defecate, and there's hardly any fecal content in the defecate. It is only blood and mucus. Number two, lower abdominal pain. And number three, frequent stools. The frequency of stools increases. If you have a more severe case, the systemic signs and symptoms and extra intestinal signs and symptoms, they are added on to the other symptomatology in the form of having systemic fever, leukocytosis, severe dehydration, hyperproteinemia and weight loss. The intestinal symptoms get aggravated in the form of severe diarrhea and cramps. Abdominal distension is there. Tenderness becomes generalized. There's a purulent rectal discharge, especially in the elderly. And you may have extraintestinal symptomatology. What are the extraintestinal symptoms? The orthopedic, the hepatobiliary, the skin, the eye can be involved. Aphthous ulcers are there. You can have a deep vein thrombosis. You can have clubbing. You can have multiple sclerosis. You can have pleuritis. So all these could be present. Now, apart from this, the important ones is the sacroiliitis and ankylosing spondylitis are 20 times more common than in general population in a patient of ulcerative colitis. 20 times. See this. And it's associated with the abnormality of HLA B27G. So there's a whole list. And apart from this, what we are concerned is the sclerosing cholangitis, which is found in 70% of these patients. Why? Because these may go into progress to cirrhosis, hepatocellular failure. And remember, we just now told you 5 times more incidence of carcinoma colon, and that also on the right side. So these are the extraintestinal manifestations of ulcerative colitis. Now, a clinical grading system helps. Why? Because that gives you an idea whether you're talking about a mild, moderate, or severe, or fulminant type. And one of the important parameters is the number of stools per day. So based on number of stools, if you have less than 4, more than 4, less than 6, more than 6 or more than 10 number of stools per day, with or without blood. So in mild cases, there's hardly any blood in it. Moderate, blood is going to be there. Severe, more amount of blood. And in fulminant, it's a continuous bleed. So along with the number of stools, the amount of bleeding, the presence or the amount of bleeding is an important parameter to grade as mild, moderate, severe. The systemic symptoms are hardly there in mild. We just not told you that. In moderate, you'll have the fever, malaise, and the fulminant, they have the abdominal tenderness, the abdominal distension, toxic megacolon. You can have chronic perforation. The external symptoms could there be even in a severe form. Markers are there which are raised in moderate in the form of ESR, CRP. You can have a low hemoglobin, albumin cutoff level 3 gram% and less than that, chronic diameter more than 6 centimeters, and in a fulminant, all the parameters are severely deranged. Now, Montreal classification, we talked about when we were talking about Crohn's disease, if you remember the last lecture, from last to last. So the Crohn's disease Montreal classification also applicable to ulcerative colitis, and ulcerative colitis helps you to define the severity and extensity of the disease. Severity in the form S1, 2, 3, mild, moderate, severe symptoms, and the extensiveness in the form of proctitis, distal colitis, or pancolitis. That means distal to splenic flexure, and this is proximal to splenic flexure. So that is E1, E2, E3, and that is how it helps you decide. A comparative classification between Montreal and Paris classification for severity and extent disease. There's just another way of deciding whether you really have a severe and how extensive disease do you have, right? Now, coming to the complications of ulcerative colitis, the acute fulminant colitis is a dreaded complication. Fortunately, occurs only in 5% of colitis in the form of toxic megacolon, and remission, fortunately, is again common in 70% with spontaneously or induced remission. Perforation can occur, hemorrhage can occur, malignancy can occur. As far as malignancy and ulcerative colitis is concerned, that is a very, very important point to be considered. And what we have to remember is that the chance of malignancy would increase with the duration. That means if the disease is present for more than 10 years from the time of diagnosis, the chance of having malignancy is 1%. But as this time increases to 30 years, it becomes almost 20%. So you have been having 30 years, you've been having ulcerative colitis diagnosed 30 years prior, then the chance of you having carcinoma colon will be almost 20%. More and more extensive disease, that means pancreatitis, it will be more chance of having malignancy. More incidence if disease start in early life, that stands to reason, because if started early life, that will be there for almost 30 years. Found often at multiple sites. Regular colonoscopic surveillance is required in a number of patients, and in those patients where it has been present for a long period of time. And how do you carry this out? This colonic surveillance is not only a visualization, it has to be combined with multiple biopsies. Minimum at every 10 centimeters you take a biopsy. 10 centimeters biopsy, 10 centimeters biopsy, next 10 centimeters another biopsy. Or you can do a dye spray for chromoendoscopy. So either two methods along with colonoscopy helps you in carrying out a colonic surveillance. It is essential. Why is the surveillance important? Number one, to diagnose the polyps with epithelial dysplasia, which may either represent, number one, dysplasia shaded lesions or masses, which is known as DALMS, frequently associated with carcinoma colon, or sporadic adenomas. So that is why this is important. Okay. The investigations, number one, the plain skygram of the abdomen, abdominal X-ray, AXR. What are you looking at? More than 6 centimeter diameter of colon at the pelvic brim, plus intramural gas and mucosal islands are all in favor of a toxic megacolon. Now, a dictum is the 369 rule, which tells you the diameter of the colon, or the large bowel, and the small bowel. And what is accepted is that on a plain skygram, if you find a diameter of 3 centimeters small bowel, it is normal. Less than that, 6 centimeters and below, you can have a normal diameter for colon, and 9 centimeters for cecum. If you have anything more than 9, more than 6, more than 3 in these respective sites, then it is an abnormal dilatation of the bowel. So remember the 369 rule for the uh, uh, plain skygram diameter of the bowel. So 3 ileum, 6 colon, 9 cecum. The double contrast barium examination, DCBE, is also helpful. It will show what? Loss of ostrations, narrow featureless colon. Featureless, that means you don't find any kind, it's just like a simple pipe. That's why it's also known as stove pipe or a lead pipe colon. Lead pipe colon or stove pipe colon, characteristic on a double contrast barium anemia. Or you can find pseudopolyps. An endoscopic examination with biopsy is the gold standard for diagnosis, which can be carried out as a sigmoidoscopy or a colonoscopy, depending upon which part of the bowel is suspecting the disease. If it's a sigmoid colon, go ahead do a sigmoidoscopy. Colonoscopy, you're suspecting the colon, go ahead do a colonoscopy, which can cover right up to the ileocecal wall. The colonoscopy has also been known to be able to visualize the terminal part of the ileum. Now, these are basically required in those patients where you find the colon involvement or the sigmoid involvement. What do you find? The granular mucosa, the ulcerative mucosa, denuded area, pseudopolyps. These were the microscopic features that we enumerated. So that's what you're looking for. Another investigation could be a radionuclide study, and these are usually indicated in those cases where you're suspecting toxic megacolon. You cannot do a colonoscopy, sigmoidoscopy in these patient acute cases. Why? For the danger of perforation. So don't do it. It's contraindicated. Any more endoscopy. So there you can take the help of radionuclide study. Now, does the ultrasound, CT, MRI help? It does help in the form of demonstrating the bowel wall condition, the bowel wall gas, and tells you about the degree of distension. The laboratory studies are basically just used to help you to decide on the extent of the disease, and number two, for a differential diagnosis and the nutritional status of the patient. The serological markers I told you, I refer to that when we talk about ulcerative colitis, and the two markers, the two antibodies we talked about were the ANCA, perinuclear anti-neutrophil cytoplasmic antibodies, and the anti-Saccharomyces cerevisiae antibody. So you find in ulcerative colitis, a positive PANCA and negative ASCA suggests ulcerative colitis. The reverse is true for Crohn's. That means the negative PNCA and positive ASCA suggests Crohn's disease. That does not mean that these antibodies cannot be found in either. Look, we said is perinuclear, ANCA is particular for ulcerative colitis. So the positive predictive rate is 76%, 94% is specific, only 50% sensitive. Is it not there in Crohn's disease? See, a very high percentage, almost 40% also present in Crohn's disease, but it's more commonly found in ulcerative. Similarly, for ASCA, 12% of patients may be having 12% ulcerative colitis patient may be having this antibody, while it is predominantly present in Crohn's disease. Comprehensive metabolic panel, inflammation markers, especially leukocytosis, raised ESR, C-reactive protein, are all helpful in, as I said earlier, in deciding about the extent of disease and the stage of disease. If you have an acute inflammatory episode, that is acute exacerbation of ulcerative colitis, these markers again become raised, the inflammatory marker. Stool bacteriology is very important to differentiate from specific colitis. We are talking about a non-specific immunological colitis, ulcerative colitis. You have differentiated from specific colitis, which bacterial colitis like Shigella colitis, Campylobacter, Clostridial difficile, pseudomembranous colitis, enterovasculitica. So these have to be identified if you want to carry out a proper differential diagnosis. A fecal calprotectin is maybe indicated for a patient of estimating this marker is indicated in patients of inflammatory bowel disease, and less than 1% with calprotectin level, these patients would be having a low incidence of inflammatory bowel disease. The differential diagnosis said earlier from the other types of inflammatory colitis and chemical colitis usually found in repeated enemas. There are patients who for their chronic constipation keep on taking enema daily or twice a day. Now these they have what is known as the chronic proctitis secondary to a chemical repeated enema. So enema induced chronic proctitis and Crohn's disease. So these are the things which have to be differentially diagnosed. The drugs are important. The just a very fast reference to drugs. The mainstay of treatment is again 5-ASA, aminosalicylic acid, chemically similar to aspirin, effective in treating ulcerative colitis. This was the basic drug used for ulcerative colitis for decades and decades. Most common form of usage would be a topical application of enema suppository, but remember it's very difficult to make the enema reach beyond the splenic flexure. That may beyond means proximal to it. So proximal colonic reach is limited, and there you have to take recourse to oral. So oral ASA in those patients where you got a more degree of colonic involvement, the descending colon, the splenic flexure, the transcolon, so on and so forth. Now, oral 5-ASA, the problem is it's maximally absorbed in the stomach. So if the absorption occurs in the stomach is not going to reach the luminal concentration that is required in the large bowel. After all, you need the luminal concentration, and that is not achievable. So what do they do with 5-ASA? They led to modification of 5-ASA in such a way that the ASA would be released or the active drug will release predominantly in the upper intestines or the upper large intestines. And these are the modified 5-ASA which are now being used, and these, the most common is the mesalamine, also known as mesalazine. The most common drug name is Mesacol, and the usual dose 1.2 to 2.4 grams per day for inducing remission and preventing relapse. Look, when we talk about treatment of ulcerative colitis, there are two parts to it. One, you have to induce a remission, and number two, you have to prevent it from relapsing. So drugs are required for both of them. So the most common drug in the 5-ASA category, which is now being used, mesalamine or mesalazine. The second is steroids, again a mainstay of treatment, and among the steroids, we can well imagine steroids have got a lot of systemic effects, side effects, which are harmful for the body. So you cannot afford to take these drugs for a long period of time. Now, budesonide is one of the newer steroids which has been modified in such a way that the extended release occurs in the colon, so the potent local action is there with minimal side effect. So the drug of choice is not prednisolone or deflazacort, which could be used for ulcerative colitis, but if you have budesonide, MMX or multi-matrix system technology budesonide, these are the preferred, this is the preferred drug now in a dose of 9 milligram per day, once a day for almost 8 weeks. If you don't have budesonide, then you can use prednisolone 20-40 milligram or deflazacort, which is 6 milligram, either as a 12-hourly, Q means 12-hourly, or as an 8-hourly dose. Now, steroids are best reserved for the flare-ups. That means you have a sudden flare up of ulcerative colitis. You were having these 3 or 4 stools per day. Now suddenly you find the blood has started appearing. You're having 10 to 12 motions, that no pain has appeared. You're having a febrile episode. So these are flare-ups. So for flare-ups, steroids are better, but not very good for maintenance therapy because they cannot be used for a prolonged period of time. Immunomodulators are again one of the major drugs which are the cornerstone for therapy, very frequently used. They did have a role in Crohn's established. In ulcerative colitis, they're now being given near role, and among all these, it is basically the azathioprine, the 6-mercaptopurine, cyclosporin, methotrexate. But apart from this, it is the 4th group of drugs which are now the preferred drugs, even as a first-line drug, and these are the biologics. And what are the biologics? These are the anti-tumor necrosis factor agents, and among them, the most well-recognized infliximab, Remicade. The induction dose are 3 doses, 0 to 6 weeks, and then you have to give them every 8 weeks as a maintenance dose. So remember, this drug can be used both as a inducing as a maintenance drug. The other TNF agents are also being used, that adalimumab and golimumab. The second group of drugs or biologics is the integrin receptor antagonists. The third are the interleukin inhibitors, and the fourth are the JAK inhibitor or the Janus kinase enzyme inhibitor. The JA is the Janus kinase enzyme inhibitor, and tofacitinib is now being more and more frequently being used in the dose of 10 milligram BD for 8 weeks, and this is given as an oral dose, see, PO. And this is as an IV dose or given over a period of more than 120 minutes, not earlier than that. You can't give a fast infusion, you'll have complication at hand. So remember, biologics have got a very major role to play in the treatment. So what do you do in a mild to moderate disease? If you look at these were the drugs used. So as an overall picture, if you got mild to moderate disease, you are going to use a combination of mesalazine suppository available as Rovassa enema or other enemas. This is just a proprietary name. Along combined with the oral 5-acid derivative, that is the mesalamine. I told you 1.2, 2.4 grams divided doses, 8 hourly, or it is now also available as a OD dosage. So very simple. You've got mild to moderate ulcerative colitis. I'll be treating this patient with a mesalazine suppository and with oral mesalazine. Simple. Nothing else is required. But in those patients who fail to respond, I may have to add a steroid, which could be a prednisolone or a budesonide in the doses that we just now said. So this is basically a step-up treatment. There's a step-up treatment. Now, the American gastroenterology recommendation is, however, different, and they say that the use of biologics with or without immunomodulator, remember the immunomodulator, the cyclosporin, azathioprine, and so on, in moderate to severe ulcerative colitis, do not go for a gradual step up after failure of 5-aminosalicylic acid. Start biologics immediately. So one pattern could be a step up treatment. I start with 5-SA, patient doesn't respond, I give this patient steroid, still doesn't respond. Now I add infliximab to this patient, which is a biologic. The AGA says no. If the patient's got moderate to severe ulcerative colitis, don't start with 5-ASA, don't start with steroid. Straight away in these patients, start a biologic. Why? You want to go in for an early induction of remission in these patients. You want to induce an early remission. If you got severe disease, then straight away start with a high dose of oral steroid, IV hydrocortisone, so intravenous, or methylprednisolone, infliximab, or any other biologic, or you can use steroid enemas. And how do you judge the response? Every 72 hours the patient should be, by 72 hours the patient should be responding. But here comes the major role for VS surgeons. So what is the indication of operation? Why are we studying ulcerative colitis up to now? Because it has got severe, serious implication. And to a number of people, ulcerative colitis can be called as a surgical disease. What are the indications when we surgeons are called for? Number one, intractability. That means the medicine is not having any response. Chronicity of the disease has been there for a long period of time. There are no remission, but it's still present. The patient has to be in drugs. The patient is fed up with drugs. High steroid dependence. Complication of stricture with intestinal obstruction. Dysplasia carcinoma sequence. Massive colonic bleed. This patient got severe hemorrhage. toxic megacolon with or without perforation, and of course extraintestinal manifestation. In all these, surgical treatment is required, and the most important gold standard, whether surgery is gold standard or not, that is open to question. But if you want to go in for surgery, I would like to call it a gold standard. Why? One, I'm curing this disease. I'm doing the whole part of the bowel removed. Number two, I'm preventing a further or a later generation of malignancy. Number two, I'm eliminating the need for a chronic use of drugs. I have to use this drug for years and years and years on end. That part is removed. So I'm getting a colectomy done and satisfactory results in as many as 90% patients. This is a very high percentage. So for all these reasons, probably in chronic cases, a surgery would be a better alternative as compared to a medicinal alternative. I'm not going to go to the details of surgery, but just you should know the principles of surgery. So one, what is being done is that part is to be removed. Agreed? Whether it is emergency or elective procedure, colectomy has to be done. Now, the extent of colectomy would depend whether it is only part of the colon involved or the total colon involved. So, if you have a partial colectomy, there's no problem. You remove partial bowel and you do a colocolic anastomosis, no problem. I remove part of the colon, anastomose the remaining part of the colon, and the end of the story. But the problem comes when I have to remove the whole of the colon. So if I am doing a total colectomy along with the rectum, say the whole thing is involved, the rectum is involved, the whole the colon is involved, that means pancolitis along with proctitis, a total colectomy or a proctocolectomy has been done. So if I am doing a total proctocolectomy, what are the end part of the intestine for me now? Is it the anal canal? No, it's hardly there. The rectum is removed. So it is a terminal ileum. So what do I do with this terminal ileum? Either I bring it out as a simple ileostomy, but the problem with simple ileostomy is that I have to have this bag lifelong and I have to go and keep emptying the bag. So I can have a continent colostomy, a continent continent ileostomy, as opposed to a non-continent ileostomy. A non-continent ileostomy keeps on exuding fecal matter every minute. It keeps on coming out of the bag, comes. In a continent ileostomy, I can evacuate it at my will. That does not empty all the time. So this is basically a construction of a nipple valve. See, this is basically a nipple valve constructed where the ileostomy has been done. So when I'm doing a proctocolectomy, that means I remove the whole of the colon and the rectum, then the ileum can be either brought out as a simple ileostomy or it can be brought out as a continent ileostomy. Simple as that. Okay? Number two, the second thing is that when I've removed the rectum, I've left the anal canal behind. See, the anus has been left behind. So what else can I do? What I can do is I can do ileo-anal anastomosis. Now you can well imagine what ileo-anal anastomosis is going to do for you. This patient is going to have severe diarrhea in and out because there is no storage function. Where is it going to be stored? The rectum had the storage function. Is any storage function remaining? No. So can I create a bag there instead of the rectum? Rectum-like bag. I can do that. That is what is known as a pouch. So I can do a pouch anastomosis. So I create a pouch with what? The terminal part of the ileum, of the ileum. And what are the pouches? There are three types of pouches. This looks like an S. This looks like a J. And this looks like a W. So simple. S pouch, J pouch, W pouch. And when I construct this pouch, I anastomose the distal part of the pouch to the anal canal. So I am doing an ileo-anal anastomosis along with the construction of a ileal pouch. So restorative proctocolectomy with ileo-anal pouch. This is ileo-anal pouch. Either of the three kinds of pouch. If it is a subtotal colectomy, no problem. I can easily go ahead and do a ileorectal anastomosis. Now, just my word about what is the difference between ulcerative colitis and Crohn's disease. You can look this up. I said earlier, distribution colon rectum. A Crohn's disease is basically anywhere in the gastrointestinal tract. Rectum always involved in one. In CD, often spared. Perianal disease is never found in ulcerative colitis, very common. Fistula, very common. Stricture, very common. So all these are very common features of CD. They are very, very rare occurrences in ulcerative colitis. Microscopically, if you look microscopically, here you mucosa, submucosa, Here you got all layers. In ulcerative colitis, which is fulminant, there you have all layers, but by and large, 95% will have only mucosa and submucosa. Are the granulomas there? No. Fissuring there? No. Crypt abscess? Common. Crypt abscess are rare in a CD or a Crohn's disease. So this is apart from the part that just been shown on the last slide. ANCA and ASCA, we talked about that, which is more common in Crohn's and which is more common ulcerative colitis. And CEA is higher level, indicates a flare up in ulcerative colitis of hardly of any use in a CD. As far as the causes are concerned, as I said earlier, smoking benefits here. Crohn's, smoking causes Crohn's. Genetic, almost same, 10 to 15% genetic bias for Crohn's, and the same for ulcerative colitis. Site, we already talked about that, right? Now, the third part of IBD was indeterminate colitis, and this is more of a pathological identity, and it is a diagnosis of exclusion. You have excluded CD, you have excluded ulcerative colitis, you have included other kinds of infective, then you would like to call it a indeterminate colitis. And 10% of colitis are such where no cause is found. It has not been identified as ulcerative, CD, or any kind of infective. You like to call it indeterminate colitis. A word about Crohn's colitis, it is 30% of CD is colonic involvement. So I said earlier, colon can be found anywhere, as opposed to ulcerative colitis is primarily a colonic disease. CD is a general intestinal disease, and 30% there will be colonic involvement. Signs and symptoms are same as ulcerative colitis, except the low incidence of toxic myocolon. CDs do not present with toxic myocolon. Toxic myocolon is a feature of ulcerative colitis. Common associations of strictures, skip lesions, fistulas, and caseating granulomas are features of Crohn's. Perineal disease are feature of Crohn's as opposed to ulcerative colitis. So in Crohn's colitis, you will have the same features if it is a Crohn's colitis, and you'll find all these lesions. Colonoscopy will show skip lesions, aphthous ulcers, serpiginous ulcers with surrounding inflammation. And the treatment is simple. The treatment is an overlap with the treatment of ulcerative colitis, and the same treatment is to carry out almost the same treatment of CD and ulcerative colitis, except for the different surgeries carried out for these two conditions. I think that's all for today. Next time we'll talk about diverticulitis, another inflammatory disease of the colon. Thank you for your time, and you'll find this lecture uploaded, I think, in the evening or tomorrow. If you have any questions, you can forward them to me, and I'll be answering them next time. Thank you for your time.